What's going on, everyone? Welcome to the Thursday, August 29th edition of the Ship My Money Show. I'm your host, Adam Scherer. You can follow me on Twitter at ShipMyMoney DFS. Only a 4-game MLB slate tonight, unfortunately. Not my favorite to play, but can be interesting to talk about. Obviously, there is a bigger game theory component. The fewer games that you have, any move that you make that negatively correlates with the field, whether it is with a pitcher or a hitter, is just going to be amplified because raw ownership is going to be higher. Since people have less options. So it does make for an interesting slate to talk about. Again, not my favorite to play, but it is what we have tonight. So still going to play it. Doesn't look like we have weather issues tonight. Knock on wood. Hopefully that holds. So as usual, going to walk through position by position and stack by stack, taking a look at what I'd be getting to right now. Keep in mind that a couple of these lineups I actually did not have when I ran everything. Toronto has a check mark up here now. So does... Actually, I had KC, I think. Toronto, I don't think I had. So things might be a little bit weird. I already noticed that I had an ownership projection of 0 on somebody that I'm getting a lot of. So Danny Jansen here is, I assume I'm going to have less. Still a good play, but I'll just touch on that right now. Already noticed that mistake that I caught too late, but going to walk through everything. If I see other weird things like that, I'll be sure to point them out. As a reminder, don't forget to hit the thumbs up button. That does help out quite a bit. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications so you get alerts when the shows go live. Going to be a changing schedule coming up as well. Haven't figured out exactly the timing of everything, but I will be doing NFL shows also. So make sure that you have subscribed to the channel and get those alerts. Starting with the pitching, this is a really weird slate overall where there's no one pitcher that really stands out as a can't miss option. There are a couple that are getting more ownership than the rest in Hunter Brown and Christopher Sanchez. Then you have a really big range of guys getting like 15 to 25% ownership. And then you have Cade Povich down at the bottom getting less than 10% against the Dodgers. So it's a pretty interesting pitching slate. I am getting to Brown and Sanchez the most, as is the field. 64% Hunter Brown in the 50 lineups that I'd be playing if the slate started right now. 48% Christopher Sanchez. They are, I think, the two best pitching plays on the slate. But like I said, none of these pitchers are without concern, without flaws. In the case of Hunter Brown, he has been very good this year, striking out about 25% of hitters, 3.6 xFIP. The problem is that Kansas City is a very difficult team to strike out. Now, you are getting them outside of Kauffman Stadium, which is beneficial. Their strikeout percentage at home this year is about 17%. Their strikeout percentage on the road does go up, but it only goes up to 20%, which is still like 26th in baseball overall. So still a very, very difficult strikeout spot for Hunter Brown going up against this Kansas City lineup, but he is a good pitcher. He is probably the best pitcher on the slate from a talent standpoint. So still getting to him. He is relatively inexpensive at $8,900 as well. It's not like we got dynamic pricing on the slate where because he's the best pitcher, Brown is suddenly, $10,500 or something. You got a reasonable salary on him. Christopher Sanchez, the other one, on closer to the field there, but still a little bit over. $6,900 price tag is nice. There's two negatives here. One, while Atlanta does have a weaker lineup than they're supposed to, their active roster does still have the 5th best WRC plus against left-handed pitching in baseball this year. It's far from a safe matchup for Sanchez. It is also a favorable park for hitting, but also he's been very good at preventing runs this year. He gets a lot of weak contact. He doesn't get a ton of strikeouts, only a 19.1% strikeout percentage, 3.2 xFIP, 2.84 FIP. Again, he's been very, very good at limiting hard contact. Normally, if you get a pitcher with a 19% strikeout percentage and you tell me he's 42 or 43% owned, I am trying to run the other direction and find as many alternatives to him as I can. But the problem is that on this slate, those alternatives aren't very good, and they're also pretty popular. Bobby Miller projected for 22%. Morton and Francis projected for between 20 and 25%. Singer around 20% on the other side of this game. So it kind of just gets back to, I guess I'm going to play a lot of these guys pretty similarly to the field because I don't really think there's an ownership edge to be had. I think that they're all pretty much correctly owned. And that just kind of puts me back to getting, around the field on Christopher Sanchez, which at that price tag, I do think is fine. Then you get the next tier of guys. Bobby Miller showing up 28% for me. Charlie Morton, 26%. Already mentioned it, but they are both 20, 25% for the field. Tough matchups for both. Morton going up against Philly in Philadelphia. They rank 21st in strikeout percentage against right-handed pitching this year on their active roster. They do also rank 21st in WRC plus at 102. For Miller, going up against an Orioles team that is dangerous in a pitcher-friendly park, Miller has not been great. He's made 9 major league starts so far this season, striking out 20.7% of hitters, 4.43 xFIP, 2.5 home runs allowed per 9 innings, double-digit walk percentage. He's supposed to be a pretty solid pitcher long-term. He has not been to date, and this is a scary matchup against the O's. But like I said, you're going to have flaws on any of the pitchers that you look at. Miller is only 7,100, Morton 8,300, so reasonable salaries there. Bowden Francis 8,100, coming off of a near no-hitter against the Angels. He took a no-hitter into the 9th inning and then promptly gave up a home run to the first batter of the inning. He's 8,100. Dangerous matchup against the Red Sox in Fenway. Goes without saying that it's a scary spot. But Boston, once again, will not have Rafael Devers in the lineup, so that makes it a little bit weaker for Francis. There are a couple of narrative concerns here, and I don't really have a way to quantify them. I didn't do anything to lower his projection in this run, and because I'm getting 14%, I probably won't in my actual run either. I was curious to see where he'd grade out. But those two concerns that I don't really have a way to quantify are that because he threw 117 pitches in that no-hit bid, I would expect, certainly wouldn't be surprised, and probably would expect that Toronto has a little bit shorter leash on him today. This is somebody that for a lot of the season they were using in, multi-inning relief role, basically. He is stretched out now. Obviously, he threw 117 pitches last time out, but I would expect that Toronto would like to maybe limit him a little bit here. And I'm not talking, he's going to throw 60 pitches or anything. I'm certainly not expecting that. But if he gets through 6 innings at like 84 pitches, 85 pitches, I wouldn't be surprised if he's done. Whereas if he hadn't thrown 117 last start, I would expect him to come back out. That's not to say that there's no chance he comes back out. It is just something to keep in mind that I think is somewhat concerning. And then the other part that is even more difficult to quantify, because you can knock an out or two off of Francis's projection, and you have quantified, at least to some extent, that risk of him being pulled a little bit earlier. The thing that I think is really difficult to quantify is how does throwing 117 pitches last time affect him today? Is he still on top of his game? Is he off a little bit? Because obviously that is not a normal workload for him or for anybody in Major League Baseball these days. So that is a concern as well. Like I said, I didn't do anything to knock him. I'm getting the 14%. I still think he's a perfectly fine play, but those are a couple of concerns that I have about him, on top of the fact that he is in a tough spot against the Red Sox in Fenway as well. Brady Singer showing up 14% for me, about 19% for the field. Very, very difficult strikeout matchup going up against Houston. He has been a good pitcher overall this year, only striking out 23% of hitters, which on this slate is actually pretty good. Only walking 6.5%, 3.57 xFIP. The Astros have one of the lowest strikeout percentages in baseball against right-handed pitching, so that's working against him. The Astros did also manage to find the left-handed bats to get into this lineup. Singer has pretty drastic strikeout splits, power splits this year. Strikeout splits, he's between 22 and 23%. To both sides of the plate. But left-handed hitters have a 370 expected WOBA and 217 expected ISO against him. Righties, 278 expected WOBA, 109 expected ISO. Now, Houston doesn't have the best lefties outside of Yordan Alvarez, who obviously is fantastic. I think one of the best individual hitters on the slate. But they did throw Ben Gamel in this lineup, John Singleton, Jason Hayward. So it is a little bit more balanced lineup than was projected earlier in the day. But, again, those aren't the scariest lefties. I still think Singer looks fine here in the context of most of the pitching on this slate doesn't look very good. Cutter Crawford, Cade Povich, the other two guys that I'm getting any of. I think they might be they're two of the only Am I back? So the screen froze for me, and then I refreshed it, and now I'm all right. I think I'm back. Um, Yeah, I could tell I was back for a second, and then I got kicked out of the room, and I think I'm back. So let me know if you still can't hear me, if I'm still frozen, or I guess it's easier. Let me know if you can hear me. But yeah, weather here. I don't know. Somebody said the weather in Baltimore is crazy. Like right now, it just looks cloudy outside, and normally I don't have internet issues regardless of what the weather's doing. But seems like I'm having them right now. So what I was saying is that I'm not getting too much Cutter Crawford, only 4%. Fields at 18. That doesn't have a ton to do with Crawford. It mostly has to do with, as you'll see in a few minutes, I have an absurd amount of Toronto bats. That is something that I don't mind on a 4-game slate, but also, wouldn't mind if it comes down. But if it does come down, then Crawford is just going to come up. I don't think Crawford is like a worse play than Francis or Singer or Morton or Miller. He's firmly in that bucket of this guy is like an average pitcher in a not great spot at 20% owned. So he's not really different than those guys. It's mostly just that I'm getting to Toronto so much. Crawford does give up power to both sides of the plate in Fenway Park. So scary spot for him. And I think that is one reason I am getting to Toronto. 221 expected ISO to lefties, 191 to righties. But he does have nearly a 23% strikeout percentage overall. That's in that same boat with Singer. It's better than Miller. So again, my lack of cutter really just has to do with how much Toronto I have. That's what's driving that. If you're not playing as much Toronto as I am, you should just be playing more Crawford than I am because he looks pretty much the same as the rest of this group of pitchers. And then I have 1 out of 50 Povich lineups right now. The case for Povich is simply that he's the only pitcher on this slate projected for less than 10% ownership. He has not been good through 10 major league starts, only striking out 15% of hitters, walking 11% of hitters, 5.93 xFIP. He does have strikeout ability, struck out 27 or 28% of hitters at AAA this year, projects for like a 20 to 22% K percentage in the majors. So he is likely to be a better pitcher going forward than he has been to date. It is obviously a very, very difficult spot against the Dodgers. But the argument here, if you're going to play Povich at all, is simply that 1, he's 5,300. 2, his raw ownership is the lowest on the board by far. And then 3, the Dodgers are most likely going to be the most popular stack. So not only are you getting a low-owned, cheap pitcher, but you're also getting somebody that if Povich does just happen to go out there and pitch well for 6 innings, not only are you getting all of those points at low ownership, but all of those Dodger stacks are falling off for your opponents as well. As you can see, I still don't think that pushes him that far up the board and got him into a lineup for me, but that would be the case for Povich. So that's every pitcher on the slate. I would have them in at least one lineup out of 50, but prioritizing Hunter Brown, Sanchez, a little bit of a drop off to Miller, Morton, Francis, Singer, Crawford. Big drop off for me to Crawford, but from an overall standpoint, I think that all of these guys are basically the same, with Sanchez looking a little bit better and Brown looking a little bit better. So pitching kind of is just going to depend on what stacks you're playing, obviously pushing down the opposing pitcher. But other than that, I think the field is pretty much right on the ownership on most of these guys. Looking at the stacks I'm getting to, I mentioned it a second ago, but getting to a ton of Toronto. One other thing that is different with this new SaberSim layout, I had talked on a show before about usually like these columns basically saying the same thing, because I did things a little bit differently with this new layout. If you're trying to see how much I would have out of 50 lineups. Look at the lineup exposure column. That's the one that is telling you that. So 68% of my lineups would have at least 2 Toronto bats, 60 would have at least 2 Boston bats, and then just flat everywhere else. 5-mans, 32% Toronto, 26% Boston, mixing and matching everywhere else. Like I said at the top of the show, I do think that ownership on that game might have been a little wonky. I know that it was on Danny Jansen, so that might be pushing it up a little bit. But at the same time, I also don't mind pretty aggressively getting to that game because it is a good hitter's park. You have similar implied run totals to everywhere else on the slate. I do expect that the Dodgers are going to get the most ownership. If I sort by my ownership projections, you can see Dodgers pretty much at the top with the exception of like Alvarez, Harper. So I expect them to get the most ownership. And then you kind of get some individual bats, some value bats. Then you start getting down to like a couple Toronto bats, but not to the same extent that you're getting to the Dodgers. And then the Blue Jays also are pretty fairly priced in a high upside spot. So I think it's also a function of you can get really good pieces around the Blue Jays. I can get to Hunter Brown with them. I can get to whatever one-offs I want. We've seen this with Toronto recently. There was a slate the other day where they were really popping up in my top stack percentage for the end game and Dub Club subscribers that I send that to. And I didn't really know why, because I thought it was an okay spot, but it wasn't, like the best spot for Toronto. But then on that slate, you actually very late into the night, I don't know what ended up winning it, but very late into the slate, you had Toronto stacks, even though they only scored like 3 or 4 runs, still at the top of tournaments, just because they'd allowed you to get to like all of the other studs that did really well on the slate. So that's something else that I think pushes Toronto up, is just that they are affordable. They do have upside, but they're affordable. So the rest of your lineup around them ends up looking really good. The only hitter in this lineup on DraftKings above $4,400 is Vlad Guerrero. He obviously is worth it, but Springer is $4,400. Everybody else is sub 4K in Fenway Park against the pitcher that gives up a bunch of home runs. So you're getting that upside from Toronto, and then you're just getting a ton of really good plays around them. I think that's another reason that they are looking so good for me. Looking individually, Danny Jansen, 58% at catcher. Like I said, this most likely comes down because I had a messed up ownership projection on him. So essentially what happens is I created my field of lineups that I think my opponents are going to play. I basically didn't give any of them Danny Jansen. And then I said, how can I beat this field? And every time Danny Jansen does well, I crush the field because nobody else has him. So the Danny Jansen comes down. That does probably also pull down how much Boston I'm getting to in general. So we can ignore that one. But the rest of it, Adley, 12%, Fields at 18%. Even with the field on JT Realmuto, I do like him here. I like the right-handed bats for the Phillies individually. Charlie Morton has given up substantially more power. I don't know if that's a word, but a substantial amount of power to right-handed hitters this year. 205 expected ISO. Also only a 20% strikeout percentage, whereas lefties have struck out 27% of the time with a 157 expected ISO. So I do like, not to take anything away from Harper or Schwarber. Obviously, I like them too. But I do like the right-handed bats here for the Phillies. JT Realmuto, of course, being one of them. Will Smith, going to get a bunch of ownership. Really good play. I'm not getting as much as the field, mostly just because it's a 4-game slate and there are limited ways to differentiate. I do think most of the offenses today have a similar range of outcomes. So that's just pulling me back on the Dodgers a little bit. Getting to a little bit of Sal Perez at catcher. I assume I have a little bit more at first base. D'Arnaud, Diaz showing up below the field. So again, these numbers are going to come up a bit once Danny Jansen comes back down. So tough position to look at because of Jansen. At first base, Vlad Guerrero really leading the way for me. 44% of my lineups, Fields only projected for 16%. If that's the case, I mean, you can look at these ownership numbers and they're pretty flat with the exception of Shohei Ohtani getting 28%. So you have Vlad, Casas, Harper, O'Hearn, Horwitz, Freeman, Diaz, Singleton, all getting pretty similar ownership to Vlad. And Vlad's really good in a nice home run spot in Fenway. We know it plays up right-handed power. Cutter Crawford this year, I think I mentioned it earlier, but 204 expected, 191 expected ISO to right-handed hitters, 21.8% strikeout percentage. Really like getting to Vlad here. And then, of course, if you're stacking the Blue Jays, that makes him look better as well. Tristan Casas, I do like a little bit over the field. I mentioned the concerns that I have with Bowden Francis just from a narrative standpoint here. Lefties, have not struck out nearly as much against Francis as righties, only about a 19% K percentage versus 29% against righties. They haven't hit for as much power either, though. 159 expected ISO for lefties against Francis, 204 against righties, but Costas is pretty fairly priced at 4,700. He is in a decent spot overall. Shohei Ohtani, self-explanatory. Don't care if it's lefty-lefty against Povich. He hits everybody. Bryce Harper, not getting as much as the field. Like I said, Morton is better against lefties. That's not to say don't play Bryce Harper. He's obviously still very, very good. But I do think that it's worth noting that he's projected for the second or third most ownership at first base. And it's not the best spot for him. Any spot for him is fine, but Morton is better against lefties. And it's not surprising either, given Morton's pitch mix. Most of the time, pitchers that rely on a good curveball will have reverse splits. It's a pitch that generally plays better against opposite-handed hitters. So whenever you see a pitcher that has reverse splits, it does help if you can have a reason for that you think it's going to continue. And in Morton's case, we've seen it for a while because he's been pitching since I was in high school. But also the fact that he relies so heavily on his curveball is a pretty easy explanation. For the field, I already mentioned pretty flat ownership with the exception of Ohtani. I think, it's a situation where I don't think any of these guys look bad. Ohtani, Freeman, Harper, O'Hearn against Miller, who has given up 2.5 home runs per 9 this year. I don't have any problems with these guys. It's mostly just that Vlad is showing up as such a priority for me that it is costing me them. But the counterpoint to that is if I do rerun everything with updated ownership and all of that, and Vlad does come down a little, it would make some sense because the opportunity cost at this position is so high. I don't necessarily love that I'm playing a million Vlad lineups and one Freddie Freeman lineup, for example. But with the way that I have the field projected right now, this is the best way to exploit them based on what I ran, is getting to these Toronto bats. Moving to second base, Chris Taylor getting the most ownership for the field. I wouldn't have any, at least at second base. It seems like a theme is going to be not getting to those Dodgers bats and then just praying that Povich and the Orioles bullpen don't suck, which is not super likely, but it's a 4-game slate. And again, the other problem, if you're going to Dodger stacks, is that you're taking, 3, 4, 5 of the most popular hitters on the slate, and there's not really pitching that offsets that. Povich being the only guy below 10%, obviously you're not playing him with those Dodgers. So you're, by definition, playing two pitchers that are at least projected for 15 to 25% ownership, if not more. You're just going to have a lot of lineups that look very, very similar to the field. That makes it difficult for me to get to the Dodgers as well. Mickey Gasper batting second, 2K flat, very, very obvious value play. But again, this is just messed up ownership projection on Boston. Gasper's ownership had not updated when I ran this. Boston's lineup had just come out. And so he's projected to not get much. He's going to be popular, and this number is going to come down. My absolute guess, just eyeballing this, is that this 4% ends up being like 20%, which makes this 44% probably come back down closer to 20% also. But he is a good value here going up against Francis at 2K. Spencer Horwitz, I'm getting a ton of him at second base. So wasn't getting him at first because I was playing so much Vlad, and there are so many other good plays at first. Getting him a lot at second base, though. If I'm getting to the Blue Jays, obviously I expect to be over the field on Horwitz. He's batting cleanup. He's 3,700. I like getting there quite a bit. Whit Merrifield as a value play is going to be pretty popular. Leading off again, going up against Sanchez. I mentioned earlier, Sanchez doesn't strike a lot of guys out. He has also held right-handed hitters to a 113 expected ISO this year. Lefties are well below 100. So he really just doesn't give up a lot of hard contact. Merrifield is a good point per dollar projection because he's 3,600 and leading off. It is a tough spot to expect him to do a lot of damage, though, given Sanchez's ability to limit hard contact. Then I'm not getting to much else at second base. But again, that's in part because I have so much Gasper, and that number is going to come down. Also, one thing to keep in mind is that there is some correlation between Boston and Toronto since they're playing in the same game. So that could be another reason that Toronto's getting pushed up, is my messed up ownership projections on Gasper and Jansen is also pulling up Toronto. I don't think that's explaining why I have as much Toronto as I do. I think they still are going to look like one of the best stacks for me. But that also is in some part playing a role. At third base, getting more Vlad, getting a bunch of Addison Barger, batting fifth, 2,700, third base outfield eligible. 15% projected ownership just looks like a good value play. The ownership is similar to most other good hitting plays on the slate. So he correlates with the other Toronto guys I'm playing and pops up. Alex Bregman going up against Singer. Singer, like I said, has given up a lot more power to lefties than righties this year. Bregman is obviously a good hitter, but only a 109 expected ISO allowed to right-handed hitters, 278 expected WOBA for Singer. Definitely would prefer lefties against him, but third base isn't the strongest position, so getting to some Bregman here makes sense. I'm a little bit over the field. Ernie Clement, I assume I'm going to have more at shortstop, projected for 10% ownership. Paul DeJong projected for 6% for KC, going up against Brown. Not getting to a lot of KC, but neither is the field. Kike Hernandez getting a bunch of ownership here. I'm not getting to him. Alec Boehm getting ownership. I'm not getting to him either, though I will reiterate that righties have done more damage against Morton so far this season. At shortstop, Ceddanne Rafaela at the top for me. He's batting ninth, not projected for much ownership. Probably won't get that much because he is batting ninth. He does give you some power upside, stolen base upside. He's only 3,400. Shortstop's not the best position since it is only a 4-game slate. You do still have Turner, Gunnar, and Witt, but you do have some value here as well. So he looks good. Getting to Nick Sogard at shortstop as well. Again, just going back to the position, but once again, didn't have him in my ownership projections, so I'm not going to have 20%, I wouldn't think. He's probably going to end up projected for like 8%. And this probably comes down to, 10 to 12. Justin Sports said, do I have a favorite FanDuel GPP pitcher? I don't. I haven't looked at the FanDuel slate. I haven't run anything for it, so I'd be lying to you if I said that I did. Obviously, it's just different than DraftKings. Pricing's different. You only roster one, so it's not even like I can take something that I've learned from DraftKings and apply it over there. Like, I assume my answer is Hunter Brown, but I couldn't even tell you what he costs or what his ownership is. Tommy Edman going to be very popular for the Dodgers. I think he's a good play. He's a good value. Shortstop and outfield eligible as well. But again, this just goes back to I'm having a hard time getting to a lot of the Dodgers because of their ownership, along with the pitching that I'm getting to. Also keep in mind that, again, all of these are going to come up, or most of these are going to come up at least a little bit once I have a correct ownership projection on Sogard. One thing that I do, or two things I do want to mention here, as far as the good shortstops go, Bobby Witt Jr., does have a good stolen base matchup. Hunter Brown has not been good at preventing stolen bases. So anybody on Kansas City that runs has a good matchup there. But Bobby Witt Jr., obviously the guy that you really single out with that. And then Trey Turner, I really, really like the matchup for him against Morton. As you can see, I'm not really getting to much right now. I would like for that to change, but kind of checks all the boxes. I already mentioned that Morton gives up more power to righties than lefties. Obviously, Turner has plenty of power from the right side. Morton's also below average at preventing stolen bases, and we know that Trey Turner will run if given the opportunity. So really, really high upside spot for Turner. Gunnar Henderson fields at 12%. I'm about half that. I like the matchup against Bobby Miller, who, like I said, has given up a ton of power this year. He has struggled, not striking out a lot of guys. So if you can get to Gunnar, great. I do think I would put him behind both of Witt and Turner, just because they come with more stolen base upside. Gunnar can run, but doesn't as often as those two will, and those two are both in above average matchups. And then finally wrapping things up in the outfield, where it appears that I actually have ownership projections for Boston, which is nice. Still seems really low to me. Like Jarren Duran and Tyler O'Neill at only 10% or less ownership seems low. Maybe those numbers come up, but if they don't, that is why I'm getting to them so aggressively. Like, these guys have massive upside here. I understand that Francis has been very, very good so far, but he doesn't project to be this good of a pitcher going forward. And you do have, or at least I do have, the concerns that I mentioned earlier about this particular start. But even if you do think he's really good, there's no doubting the upside that Jarren Duran and Tyler O'Neill give you. And this is a 4-game slate. So if this ownership is real and continues to be how I project them going into the slate, I do think I'm going to get a lot of them and be happy with it. Varsho and Springer, same thing. 13% ownership in Fenway Park on a 4-game slate. If everybody's just going to play Teoscar Hernandez and, Harper and these other guys, obviously I think those are good plays, but you have upside with Varsho and Springer. They're also cheap, which makes the rest of your lineup better. Yordan Alvarez, I am getting to 24%, fields at 18. So that is a pretty popular player that I am over the field on. I mentioned earlier, I think he's one of the best individual hitting plays on the slate. he's a good play against anybody, but then you also throw in Brady Singer and his inability to limit power to left-handed hitters this year, and it makes Alvarez look really good. I am around the field on Hernandez at 4,900. Obviously like the spot for him. Then drops off a little bit to Schwarber, Melendez, getting more Barger. I already had a bunch earlier. Ownership-wise, I'm not getting a ton of Ohtani on this slate, and it sucks, but it's just a function of he's going to be like 30%. He's going to be like 30% owned probably, and he's a hitter, and it's a 4-game slate, and I'm playing popular pitching. So can't get to as much Ohtani as I would like, but whatever I do get to, I'll be happy about. Same for Mookie. Same really for any of these Dodgers. It's a very, very good spot for the Dodgers. It's just an ownership thing. So whatever Dodgers I can get to in lineups that make sense from an ownership standpoint, I want. I think it is the best spot on the slate. It's just that I don't think it's like from a range of outcome standpoint, head and shoulders better than the Boston game, for example, to where I'm going to just eat all of that ownership and stack 5 Dodgers plus Brown plus whatever SP2. So that's kind of the problem. But wherever I can get to Ohtani, Betts, Edman, like I want these guys. Hernandez, they are in a very, very good spot. They are clearly high upside plays. They are also expensive. So that's the other thing too, is you are going to get the field getting to a lot of Dodgers. But if I go like Toronto, for example, I then get access to the best one-offs, the best mini stacks, which is more useful on bigger slates where you just have more of them. But, if you're 5-man stacking the Dodgers, it's going to be tough for you to get to like Bobby Witt or Yordan Alvarez or Tyler O'Neill or Jarren Duran. Whereas if I'm going Toronto, I can get all of those guys that are lower owned than the Dodgers are. So that's something else to keep in mind. Fields getting to Barger at 15%. Like I said, I'm well over that. So pretty interesting slate. From an overview standpoint, Hunter Brown, I think, is the number one guy, number one pitcher. Christopher Sanchez is 2. I think every other pitcher other than Povich looks basically the same. And then Povich is the bottom guy as far as projection goes, but he is the only guy not getting ownership. So he does have that working for him. Offensively, keep in mind that I had messed up ownership projections on Boston, which is driving them up for sure, and probably driving Toronto up a little bit as a result. But either way, I do think I'm going to like this Fenway game, assuming that ownership doesn't change drastically. Like if Tyler O'Neill, Jarren Duran, Springer, Varsho are all going to be 10 to 15% projected ownership, and then you assume that guys like Jansen and Sogard that I didn't have ownership projections for are going to come in at like 8 to 20%, 15 to 20 on Jansen probably, I would assume, because he's a catcher, and then like 8 or something on Sogard. It is still going to look like a game that I want to get to just because of the park and the fact that both pitchers are average to good, but they do both still have some flaws. Crawford gives up a lot of power. Francis has given up power to righties this year and did throw 117 pitches last time out. So I do like the Fenway game. I think there's a pretty good chance. I don't like it as much as is on the screen right now, but I do think I'm going to get to it a lot. Dodgers, I am mostly using as mini stacks, only one 5-man Dodger stack, using them, as 2-mans, a couple 3-mans in there to try and offset some of the ownership. Also, Stephen Leibowitz said Boston temps in the 60s tonight. Yeah, it makes it worse hitting conditions than it would have been otherwise, but that's also reflected in run totals. This matchup in a 90-degree day in Boston is going to be like 5.5 on Boston and 5 on Toronto. So that is reflected there, but it is a good point too, where it's not necessarily reflected perfectly because from a DFS standpoint, you're trying to get home runs, and it doesn't actually, like the implied run totals don't tell the whole story, because if Boston scores 5-6 runs in this game, but they're not hitting home runs, it doesn't do you much good from a DFS standpoint. And the weather, the temperature does impact home runs more directly, which we know is what we really need in DFS. So it is a negative, but also on a 4-game slate, I just can't care that much. Baltimore showing up for me, Atlanta, KC, just pretty flat on these guys after getting, jamming in Fenway. So I assume that once Toronto and Boston come down at least somewhat, probably getting to a little bit more Baltimore, Atlanta, KC, Philly, Houston, any of these teams could pop up a little bit more. I think it's just a really weird slate where the Dodgers look like the overall best stack. They have the best matchup against Povich. They are facing a weak Baltimore bullpen in a good park, but they're also just going to get so much ownership that then the rest of these teams just look very, very similar. It's reflected in the implied run totals. You have quality pitchers for every team. Morton, Sanchez, Francis, Crawford, Singer, and Brown are all average at worst pitchers. So it's a really weird slate where I think playing ownership is really just what I'm going to end up doing, looking to exploit the field where maybe they are leaning a little bit too heavily on median projections and not enough on range of outcomes, and just hope that, whatever I end up on wins out, because all of these spots look pretty similar. Again, a slight edge to the Dodgers, but very, very similar spots for all of these teams. So ownership is going to play a big role. Trying to negatively correlate with the field plays a big role as well. So that's another thing sort of working against, or another reason that I'm not getting a ton of Dodger stacks, is if the Dodgers light up Povich, you're still not, like, that fact by itself is not helping you pass anybody. If the Blue Jays go off or the Red Sox go off, I'm immediately just jumping ahead of the 20% that have Crawford or the 25% that have Francis. So that helps too. Whereas the Dodgers, not only are you just taking on a bunch of ownership and playing a bunch of similar lineups to everybody else, but you're not even leapfrogging anybody when they do well, because nobody's playing Cade Povich. So that's another thing kind of working against them, that every other stack on the slate has working for them, because every other pitcher is projected for at least 15% ownership. So very interesting slate, I think. I think there's a lot of different ways that you can go on it. I don't think any of them are wrong. I think it's pretty wide open. If you are going to the Dodgers, make sure that you're trying to find some way to be different. I don't really know what that is, which is another reason that I'm not really getting to them. But that's the only spot that I think I would point to and say, like, make sure you're paying attention to the lineups that you're playing and how they look with the Dodgers. Everything else, I think, is pretty wide open, 10 to 15% ownership on most other spots, similar range of outcomes on most other spots. So that's all I have for you on this one. If there's no more questions, don't forget, hit the thumbs up button, subscribe to the channel. Also sign up for Endgame Syndicate using the link in the description below. We are doing our last monthly roundtable before NFL season starts on Monday. So if you want to get in there, ask questions to Uticow, myself, Brick75, Nerdy Tenor, about DFS strategy, process, NFL, whatever it is, get in there before Monday, ask your questions. We will be doing our live roundtable then. It will be the last one before NFL season starts. So be sure to check that out. And I will be back here again tomorrow at the same time, doing the same show. Thanks again for watching.